This is the image I've chosen to use for this demonstration. I've opened it up into Adobe Camera Raw because we're going to do a little bit of work on this before we start the filtration process. Now, the image was shot with a Canon EOS 1DS camera a few years ago now, and I believe that camera recorded 11 million pixels, so not quite as many as the current cameras of 20 million and above. But this particular image is going to have more than enough pixels to be able to do what we need to do. In fact, when I get the image into Photoshop, I'm going to reduce it still further. But for the moment, just thinking about why I want this image, I'm making a slideshow. The slideshow aspect ratio is 16:9. So I'm going to crop the image in Camera Raw if I can, and looking at it, it looks positive. So let's make a start by going to the crop tool in Camera Raw, click and hold, and we have a number of presets at different aspect ratios, and one of them is called 9:16. Well, that's what Adobe calls it. Most of us tend to say 16:9, but it amounts to the same thing. So I'm going to select that, and I can click and drag. Now when I do so, I know that shape is 16:9. I can move it around, and you can see instantly it's doing me a big favor here because it allows me to get rid of that dark area at the top. So I can bring the crop down. I want a little space at the bottom, maybe just to include that shadow. I don't want to be too tight at the top, but when I'm happy with that, if I just touch the enter key, it commits that crop, but of course we're working raw and we can always back away. One of the things I'm tempted to say here is because we're making a decision to move away from a photo quality image to a more artistic one, then all of those good practices we normally adopt for those high resolution photographic projects can largely go out of the window because we're not trying to retain that high photographic quality. In fact, just the opposite. Having said that, when we open up an image into Camera Raw, most of us, I think, develop our own routine, and it's not a bad idea to follow that routine, but just having what you're intending to do later in mind as you begin the process. I'm going to start by going to my lens corrections, and I'm going to tick the box to remove chromatic aberration. Now we can always argue that what we're about to do here, that's hardly going to be a problem, but you can see what I mean. It's the practice I always do, so I may as well stay with it. Going back to the Basic tab, what do I want to do next? There's not a great deal I think needs doing. I'm not too keen on the limey green colour of the grass because it's lit by the sun, but the rest of the colours I feel are pretty good. So what I might do is have a look at giving this just a little bit of clarity, maybe a little bit of shadow detail just to lighten up the shadows. I may just give it a little touch of whites just to give it a bit of sparkle, but I'm going to also try to do something with the green. So I can do that by going to this option, my hue, saturation and luminance slider, selecting the saturation tab and dropping down the green slider, and usually if we take the yellow with it, that helps too. If you switch to the luminance, sometimes you can actually darken it as well. So you can see I can kill two birds with one stone here. It's taken the edge a little bit off of some of my figures perhaps, so I'm going to switch back to the Basic tab, maybe just inject a little more clarity. Little blacks, you can see I'm fiddling around here to get the effect I want. Maybe a little vibrance, but I don't want to do too much and bring back the very green that I've just spent time removing. Now I can open this up into Photoshop. Now one of the first things I want to do is to reduce the resolution. Now I'm about to produce an image for a slideshow. The slideshow, I know the aspect ratio is 16:9. Generally speaking, many of our PC screens and televisions run at a resolution of 1920-1080, which is 16:9. I'm going to choose to go a little bit higher than that because I'm going to be using this in slideshow software called Pictures to Exe, and I'm going to make it slightly bigger, but while retaining the 16:9 aspect ratio. Why slightly bigger? It's only going to be shown at 1920-1080, so why do I want it larger? Well, if I need to do a little bit of zooming in or zooming out, I've got a few extra pixels to do so. Now I know that the aspect ratio is already 16:9, so all I really need to do is go to my image menu, choose image size, and I need to place in the values here, making sure I'm using pixels, and the pixel value I'm going to choose is 2560, and as you can see the height defaults to 1440, retaining the 16:9 because the width and height are linked. Clicking OK, the image will reduce in size just a little bit. I can hit Ctrl-0 to fit it back on screen. In normal circumstances, if we were making a high resolution photographic print, we may be turning our attention to this little distraction on the left here and asking ourselves, what can we do to remove the drum that's poking in from the left from someone who's obviously just out of shot at the head of this particular parade? I don't think we need to bother with the sort of filtering we're going to apply here, so we can safely ignore small things like that. But we can certainly look around the image and make sure that we deal with some of the larger areas that could be distracting. Now there's not a great deal in this picture, but I'm going to pick up my spot healing brush here because we've got a little shadow down there and a little bit of white. These things are nothing, and generally speaking, with the filtration, as I've said, we're not going to see any of these, but sometimes the filtration does react not so well with certain aspects, and in that case it can make a little blemish that we need to deal with later. No great problem, but it's just the way I work, and if I can see things which are obviously distracting, even though I'm going to apply a filter, I'm going to deal with them. Now this is a Civil War reenactment, as many of you probably know, and what I've just done is to save this, and I've called it Civil War 001, because the nature of filtration is experimental. So it's going to pay dividends if we save different versions as we go through the manipulation process. I'm going to make a start by going to my layers over on the right hand side, and I'm going to make a copy of my background layer. Ctrl-J is a nice shortcut to do that. What I want to do is apply my filter effect to this layer, but I want to retain an original sitting at the bottom of the stack. The reason I want to do that is because when we apply a filter effect, particularly to faces in a group like these, where the faces are not big, the faces can be badly distorted. Sometimes that works in our favour because it allows us to subdue people who we don't want at the forefront of our image, but sometimes it just looks odd. So it's nice to have an original sitting at the bottom of the stack from which we can always bring back some detail via a layer and a layer mask. So now I'm free to look at the first filter effect I wish to apply. So I'm going to go to my filters at the top of the screen. The filters we're going to be using are Topaz Labs, and the ones I'm going to single out is Topaz Impression. Take just a few seconds to appear on screen, especially when you launch them for the first time, but it usually speeds up once we get the software up and running. Now, allowing the Topaz impression filter to launch and settle, by chance it settled on the top of the list on the right hand side. These are presets under the heading at the top right of a featured set of filters. Now I hope you'll agree with me that isn't an uninteresting start to a manipulation of this type, and in fact I'm looking for something along these lines, something that has a monochrome look, something that's breaking up the image quite a bit, something I can bring some colour through. But let's not just take the easy option here. Let me take you to one or two of the other filters which I quite liked in a different set. So I'm going to go to my featured set at the top, click and hold, and select Ancient. Now what we have here is the preset of the first filter in the set called Ancient applied to our image, and we can just click down all of these and take a look at the effect. Now that one looks particularly attractive, but I'm looking for a lined version at the moment. But I may come back to that one. I like the look of that. I'm going to scroll down. The ones I'm really interested in is one of these four. So I'm going to use my down arrow here. There's one. There's the next. There's the next. And the final one. I think out of those, and we would get a result in any of these, but I'm going to pick this one. I'm also going to adjust it because these are presets. We can make an adjustment. I was going to try to do something with the edge effect here and see if I can actually darken it down, and if not, increase the contrast a little bit maybe. So if we click in this little symbol here, we get all of the options open, and there's a lot of them. But I'm going to take you down to the bottom because it's this one, the background color, that I want to adjust. I'm going to click it. I'm going to move over. I don't want it to be more colorful, but I'm going to try it and see how it looks darker. So I'm going to move over to there and click OK. Do I like the look of that? To be honest, I'm not too sure. I'm going to go back and click again. This is what I mean about filters being a trial and error sort of thing. Because I'm going to come back maybe the other way. I'm going to move down here. I don't want it too bright, but yeah, I think I'm going to live with that. I'm quite happy with that, so I'm going to click OK to open this up into Photoshop. Now before I do anything here, I'm going to open up my levels. Now you'll find the levels in your image menu. I'm going to use Control L to bring these up on screen, and I'll move them up at the top right so we leave most of the image visible. I'm just going to tweak this a little bit. I just want a little more impact in the picture, maybe something like that. That'll do. But now if I go to the layers here, you'll notice that we've got our filtered version, but we still have our original at the bottom of the stack. Now, for reasons I don't quite know, I've managed to drag my layers slightly out of my holding area on the right, but I'm using Photoshop Creative Cloud, and I can go to this option and I can reset my own personal screen setting. So I've just slotted it back in place. What I want to do next is to go back and select that other filter, the one I saw a few moments ago. To do that, I need to select my background, my original, and I need to make another copy of that. So Control J once again. Now I think it's probably time we saved over the top of our Civil War 001, but perhaps we can stall just for a moment until we get the filter in place that we need underneath this one. So with the colored image selected, let's go back to our filters, Topaz Labs and Impression. We know exactly where the preset is, and we were happy with it, or I was happy with it. It's gone back to the featured set, so I'll just select the Ancient once again, and it was the third one down, and that I am happy with. So I don't feel the need to make any changes here. I'm going to click OK to open this up into Photoshop. Now of course we don't see the instant results of what we've just done because of the stacking order of the images. So looking at them once again, there's the original sitting at the bottom of the stack. We're almost certain to need that to help bring through some of the faces. There's the one that I quite liked, the more impressionist looking image. But there's the one that's going to give us hopefully our old world look. So at this stage what we really need to do is maybe hit Control S or save over the top of Civil War 1 so that all of the work we've done so far is safely stored. Now this is where the creative work begins. There's no rights and wrongs here, and I always describe this as flying by the seat of our pants. In other words, we do what we feel looks right. Now we've got all three of these particular layers saved in our layered stack. What we want to do is to allow some of the colour from the layer that's sitting beneath this one to show through. Now what we could do, if we were perhaps creating an image for a different purpose, we could use that colour, that strategic colour, to emphasize composition. For example, if I pick up my crop tool and click so we can see the rule of thirds, if we were trying to draw attention to a strong part of the image from a compositional point of view, then it would be this guy who we would allow some colour to come through. But because I'm doing this for a different reason, I think I'm going to bring colour through from this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, and this guy. Now we can see in the centre of the frame, pretty easy to see the outlines of the person, but we don't have to be precise anyway. Difficult to see them at the extreme ends of the image. But it doesn't matter. We can always mask more than we need and then mask back afterwards. I'm sure I'll demonstrate that. Let's go to our layers. Let's apply a layer mask here, and we do that from the bottom of the layer stack. You can see it's selected. What we can also do is pick up black from the bottom of the toolbox. We need a soft edge brush. I'm using my basic brushes. If when you select the brushes and you look at them up at the top left here, they're not basic, you can always get your basic brushes by selecting them from here. Click OK and they'll replace any of the brushes you had in there. By all means, try some of the more fancy brushes for what I'm about to do here, because you may stumble on something pretty unique. But I'm going to use a soft edge brush. I'm also going to look up at the top here at the opacity. I want that set at 100. And I'm going to click this little icon so I can adjust the flow of my brush using the number keys on the keyboard. So I'm going to use 0.5 to drop my flow down to 5%. I can use the bracket keys on the keyboard to the right of the letter P to increase and decrease the size of the brush. And now I'm ready to do some work. Remember, no rights and wrongs here, and also there's very little risk because we're working with layers and masks. So I'm going to start to bring through some of the colour that I feel needs to be brought through. And what you'll notice straight away is I don't have to be anywhere near as precise that we would have to be if we were doing a piece of work like this in photo quality. We would have quite some degree of difficulty in doing that. Now you can see that we're bringing through some of the grass from the background, but don't worry too much about that, because we can always go back and remove that a little bit later. Let me show you how to do that perhaps before I even move on. If we're spraying black onto the mask, and that allows part of this layer to remain transparent or partially transparent to allow this layer to show through, then of course we can repair the mask easily by switching from black to white. If I switch to black to white, and I'll zoom in a little bit on the hat just to show you how this is done, I can drop the size of my brush down. I may even want to push the flow up to maybe 20%. I'm just going to carefully just remove what green that I don't think is doing me any favours with this particular image. I doubt it's super critical, but we're never really sure, so I can just pay a bit of attention down here. But as you see, it's not a difficult or time-consuming job because I can do most of the work while I'm talking to you. As we come down, we can touch in other areas. If you're not certain and you want to be a bit more careful with your masking, then you wouldn't have to do this, but as you see, it's no great shakes. So I can remove what I think needs removing. I'm going to hit Control 0 because what I need to do now is move on and do some of these other figures. Now you can see the technique I used and how little time I actually spent on it. Perhaps I'll do just one or two others and then I'll finish off outside of the video recording. If I go to the next guy and use those square bracket keys to increase the size of the brush, if you look down at the bottom of the toolbox, you'll see that I've currently got white selected because I was repairing that green on the left. Well, if you want to switch between your foreground and background colours, the X key is very useful. As you can see, it just toggles them. So I can switch to black and I can start to do this guy. I don't think I'll bring the guy in behind him. I think we'll let him drop into the background if we can, and I'm sure we can. But a little bit of this guy happens to have a green hat, but that's fine. Dropping down the size of the brush, just giving a little sweep down the legs. You can see I'm not being too fussy here at all, and this really was how I created all of the images for the audio visual, which I hope you may have seen by now. There's a nice bit of colour coming down there, so I can select all of that. And again, for the same reasons I explained a few moments ago, not worry at all about that green, because all I've got to do is to switch to white and I can repair the green in just a few seconds. And there's some nice colours coming through the drum. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to switch to white. I'm going to drop the brush down. In fact, I've left my flow at 20% to bring that colour through, but we got away with it okay. But you can see we can do the same as we did before, and we don't have to be super fussy. Remember, we're filtering the image, we're trying to give this an impressionistic feel, so we don't need any of that precise masking that we may want with a photo quality image. Now I'm going to continue and just do the same thing for the last three figures. Now, in hindsight, it's taken me so little time to add the colour and remove any of the green around the edges I felt was a problem. I could have actually recorded the whole thing. But I think you get a feel for how this is done. We do not have to be anywhere near as precise, and we need to let our, I suppose, artistic qualities run free for a little bit. Looking at the image as I come back, first thing I need to do is to, I think, click Save. On this occasion I'll save over the top of Civil War 001 because everything I've got in my layered stack I could go back on and make changes to. But there is one part of the image that's already now beginning to annoy me a little bit, and that's the guy in the background who's got a big feather on his hat and it's sticking up at the back, and I want to get rid of that. So I'm a great believer in dealing with problems as you see them. So I need to go to my layers. I need to move away from the mask I've been working on and click into the image. If I pick up my spot healing brush and make my brush a little bigger, I feel certain one touch of that and it'll be gone. Now, while I've got this brush, there's another area which I've noticed. Now, there's someone's foot just stepping in underneath the cloak here, and to be honest, I've just cut his foot off. Just something that's attracting my attention. Now, I'm looking around the image with a critical eye, and I can't really see any more problems that I want to deal with. I'm quite happy to move forward from this particular point. Now, what we do from here is not set in stone, but what we could also do, this is really belt and braces 2 times over, but if I go to File, Save As, and save my work now with a different name, I've got all of that saved twice because I'm going to make a change now. But again, I'm going to suggest there's something we can do here which would make even that superfluous. I want to amalgamate these two because I want to do something with the faces. Now, I could just select both of those using the Control key, right click, and I could choose to merge those layers. And there would be nothing wrong in doing that because we've got it saved anyway. But a little tip that you might want to use in certain circumstances. I'm going to create a new blank layer at the top of my layered stack. I'm going to turn off this layer so I've just got these two selected. If I hold my Alt key while going to the top right of the layers and selecting Merge Visible, what Photoshop does, it takes that layer and that layer, which are the two we've been working on, and amalgamates them into that layer. So I can turn these two off they're not required for the moment. Because what I'd like to do is, I think, two things. First of all, I'd like to look at the levels of this picture now. I'm just going to hit Control L to bring up the levels. Just going to have a little tweak around to see if I darken it a little bit. Do I like the effect? Does it need any lightening here? Well, you can see we're all going to choose something different, but I'm reasonably happy with what I can see there, so I'm going to click OK. Now I'm going to go back to my layers and apply another layer mask here. To make it a bit more relevant, let me remove that lock and move that layer up. So if you think of the bottom two as our insurance, what we have here is our filtered image sitting over the top of an unfiltered image. Because what I want to do is to select my mask, and I want to bring a little bit of detail back from these faces. You can see they look a little bit odd, don't they? Now let me start with the guy on the right hand side, and I'm going to zoom in a bit on his face. If you're wondering how I'm managing to zoom in without going over and selecting the zoom tool, whatever tool you've got selected, if you hit the Control and the spacebar key together, you can see the zoom in plus mode appears, and if you touch the Alt key with that, you get the minus zoom as well, so it's very convenient. Looking down at the bottom of the toolbox, you'll notice I've got white as my foreground color and I need the black, so I'm going to hit the X key. I'm going to pick up my brush again. This time I'm going to drop the flow rate down quite low to something like 3%. I've just hit 0.3 on the keyboard because I've got this little icon checked and I can adjust that with the numbers on the keyboard. I need to be very delicate because I want to bring back some of the face so it doesn't look weird and odd, but I don't want to bring it back so we then start to get it looking odd for a different reason, and the reason is because we've got photo quality mixed with the image that's filtered. That one works okay. Just a couple of sweeps over here just to bring a hint of the face through. Nothing too much, but just enough, leaving a bit of texture there. Moving across, I can do all of these. This one probably needs a little less. This one looks rather weird, and I've got a little bit of green around there which I may actually deal with in a moment or two. And this one as well. There you can see it, that's coming through. And finally this one, which doesn't take very long at all. Need a bit more on this one just to bring the features because his face is looking to the left. Couple of areas of green I'm going to deal with, so I'll just switch to white, increase my flow rate of the tool to 20%, drop the brush down, and I'll just tidy up any of those green areas that I think are having an effect on my image. As I said a number of times, I don't think they're really crucial, but sometimes they can be a little distracting. This one's probably the worst of them. So let me hit Control 0 and fit the image on screen, and because I've made some changes now to my Civil War 2, Control S to save over the top of the previous version is not a bad thing to do. Now we're in the same position we was a few moments ago. If I take you back to the layers, to continue this I would really like to amalgamate these two together, and we've got to do that at some stage. So once we're happy that we've got a good amalgamation of the two, then we can do that. We can either work the same as I did a few moments ago by creating a new blank layer, holding the Alt key and just merging the visible layers into a new layer. But here let's do it the other way. Let's just select both of them, right click and choose Merge Layers. What I'd like to do now is to darken the edges and corners down quite considerably. But that can be quite tricky because whilst I want them to be fairly dark, especially right on the edge, I don't want to encroach too much onto the people. But the nature of the way we do this with a back and forth movement of the brush tends to ensure that we do encroach on the people. But of course, if we go to our layers first and we create a new blank layer, we can spray black just on this layer. By all means, try different types of brushes for this and experiment. But what I'm going to do is just drop the size of this down just a little bit. So Control, Alt, spacebar, click a couple of times. The only reason I'm doing that is to give myself room to maneuver around the edge. I've got black as my foreground colour selected. I've got my soft edge brush once again. Now I'll use the bracket keys to get the brush fairly large. The flow rate, I think I don't want that much above 5%. I'm going to start brushing over the corners first because they usually need more work than the rest because of the nature of the filter. But you can see the movement I'm doing left and right, and what I'm going to do is to move all the way around this image and gradually build up a nice dark edge over there and down the side. And whilst I don't want to encroach too much onto my figures and obliterate them, because I'm working on a new blank layer, I don't have to be super fussy with this, because I'll show you how we can get away with this in a few moments. It's tempting when you're doing this and it's taking a little time. It's very tempting to push the flow rate up of the brush, but the trouble is if you do that, then the brush and the flow of colour from it starts to run away with us and we lose control, and suddenly we find ourselves producing something which is not quite so attractive. So it probably pays to just be a little bit patient with this, because it's a crucial part of this old master sort of look that I'm aiming for. But there you can see what I have. I'm going to come in a little more over on the left and the right because I want to demonstrate the next technique. I'm going to hit Ctrl-0 to open this up. Now the reason I've placed that shading on a new layer is to give me control. We could have just painted it straight on the image, couldn't we? But if I go back to my layers now, if I've got certain areas of that shading which is encroaching too much on my image, all I need is a mask again. Place a mask on that layer, pick up black as my foreground colour, adjust my brush to an appropriate size, and maybe I can increase the flow to about 10%, but now if it starts to encroach a bit too much on my drummer on the left, you can see 10% is a little bit too much, so I'm going to go back to 5. You can see that I can alleviate the shading just in those areas where I don't want it. We've got a nice drum on the right, so you can see the flexibility we have by working in this way. Now you'll notice there are one or two little spots and blemishes around the legs of the people, and what I've just done is to save this as Civil War 3 because I'm getting to the stage where I'm quite happy to go up here and choose to flatten all of those together, and I don't need the previous ones because we've got them saved. Then I can pick up my spot healing brush. I can zoom in on any of these final areas where I think I need to do a little bit of work, and I'm a little bit fussy and finicky about these things, but I'm also well aware how highlights can affect an image, and it's only when you see an image where all of these highlights have been corrected and then you can switch them on and off or look at a before and after that you realize that they actually do more damage than you probably give them credit for. So there's just one or two here, nothing too much to do. Now one of the last things we can do, when I applied the color filter effect, we got a bit of texture, and we can see that probably mostly in the lighter tones. Sometimes we may want to apply a filter effect, a texture effect to the image. Now we can do that on a new blank layer too. If I go to the top of the screen on the left, choose Layer, New Layer. From the New Layer option, I'm going to choose the mode, Overlay, and I'm going to tick the box to fill with an overlay neutral colour, which is 50% grey. When I click OK, if I'm placing a layer over the top of an image and filling it with 50% grey, you would expect the image to disappear under grey. Nothing happens. But when we go to the layers, we can see the grey, and if I turn off my image, we can see the grey then. It's solely because this grey is being blended with this image via overlay, which gives us the opportunity to apply our texture to a new layer. There's lots of different texture effects you can find on the internet, but let's keep things simple by going to Filter, Texture and Texturizer from the Photoshop versions. As you know, we've got Brick, which is not really suitable for what we're doing here, Burlap, which is probably the one I'll choose, we've got Canvas, and we've got Sandstone. Let's choose Burlap so it's easy to see. I'm going to put the scaling up as high as I can get it. The relief, I'm going to keep it delicate, 1 or 2. Let's go with 2. And the lighting, top left or bottom left or top right, one of those to give us the up and down shape, and click OK. Now if I zoom in over here, there you can see the texture, but it's applied to the whole image, and we may only want it to be applied to the outer edge. And this is why we produce these things on new layers, because once again we can put a layer mask, pick up black, pick up our brush, make my brush nice and large. This time I'll push my flow up to about 30%, and I can mask away the texture around the main figures, just leaving that texture around the edge. Freedom to create is what the layers gives us. Now at some stage, of course, we would probably even save this again as Civil War 4. Why do we keep doing this? Well, it's not uncommon, to be honest, to do something on Monday night that looks great. And when we look at the image on Tuesday morning, we wonder what possessed us to apply that filter effect. Well, isn't it nice to be able to go back to just before we applied the effect and drop that in the bin? But here I'm quite happy with it, so I'm going to choose to flatten the image. But just to finish, I'm going to suggest there's one little tip you may want to use, and it's more relevant when we're using filters like this, and I had to use it a few times producing the images for my audio-visual. Create a new blank layer over the top of your image, because sometimes when we're actually filtering an image, like we was talking about the faces, certain areas can be obliterated and you can lose sometimes some important detail you'd rather like to keep. Now there's not a great deal here, but maybe I can just demonstrate this on the legs of the guy on the right. Supposing we wanted to bring the edges of these legs through just a little more strongly. Well, I've got black as my foreground colour. I'm going to choose my pencil this time. I'm going to use an opacity. We don't get 2 options here, just the one. So I'm going to drop that down to 50%. Let's have a look at my brush size. You can see the brush size there. And what I could do is just have a go. As soon as I've started to do that, I've realized that my opacity is set far too high. So I can use my undo history here to back away and to drop that opacity down maybe to 30%, and maybe even bring my pencil down to a slightly smaller size. And all I want to do here is to just give a bit of shape to the edge. Remember, because we've been filtering the image here, you know, this sort of thing is sort of something which just works okay. It's not a great problem, but we wouldn't think of doing this on a photo quality image. I got it a bit wrong there, not concentrating, so Control Z. Get the image much bigger. I'm trying to do this a little bit too quick, really, I think. But you can see I just want to follow the edge of the leg just a little bit, just to give it a little bit of density, not much. And when we zoom out, it just looks pretty good. Now you can use that for all sorts of minute detail. Sometimes you may find you get a better result if you switch to your soft edge brush, or you could pick one of the hard edge brushes and make them really small. But I like the result of this particular image. The one thing we need to bear in mind, of course, is we're not looking at this at 100%. If we select the zoom and hit 100%, there we can see the sort of quality of the work we have, and we certainly have created a good and, I hope, unique filter effect which has the look of an old master. Now I've got 2 layers in my layers palette because I added those little lines. Let's flatten this. And of course there's always going to be a time when we think perhaps we've got too much colour, so always save this version. But if you want to then look at an option just to remove a little bit of saturation, if you feel we need a more delicate saturation. You see what I mean? Everything changes the image, and there's going to be a huge amount of personal choice here. But having done that, I think that delicate colour looks a little better to me. It balances better with the background. So there we have our completed image.